Hi, my name is Noah Isenberg, and I'm a film scholar at the New School, talking with you today at the Quad Cinema in Greenwich Village for Cohen Media Channel. The film I'm introducing is a relatively unknown film by William Dieterle called Syncopation, a film from 1942 that chronicles the rise of jazz in America. There were a number of films that would be done at this time that cast a lens on that American subculture, and Dieterle does so in this film as well. In many instances, it's really out of sync with his other work as a director. Dieterle is much better known for his biopics, among others, The Life of Émile Zola, starring Paul Muni, his biopic on Louis Pasteur, his Juarez, all of these films done for Warner Brothers in the 1930s. Syncopation's a very, very different film. And in fact, the way in which he tells the story is, for eyes in 2017, perhaps a bit hard to take, especially when he opens the film in the deepest, darkest Africa and is showing the origins of jazz. It really is very difficult to look at those scenes today, I think, and not wonder about exoticism, about something that Edward Said would call Orientalism. But the film really gains its traction as it moves then from Africa to the jazz scene in New Orleans. And it addresses a question, a rather similarly thorny question to exoticism and Orientalism, the question of cultural appropriation. We find ourselves in New Orleans around the turn of the century, and the film shows us the origins of jazz gaining traction not only in the African American community, but as it began to make inroads into the white community. And it's there that the film takes up that thorny issue of cultural appropriation. And it does so by showing how jazz travels north and travels. If we follow the arc of the story, I think it's how the jazz makes its way to Chicago and makes its way into the hands of these largely white big band musicians. The end point of this film with that final montage in which we have Gene Krupa, Benny Goodman, you're really missing a lot of the story that really lies at the beginning of this film, and then is well, for lack of a better term, whitewashed by the time we end the film. It's a film that hasn't really been as widely viewed as other films by Dieterle, and I think that its principal value is a window onto jazz and the ways in which a European-born filmmaker like Dieterle, who was born in Germany and came to America in the 1920s, how it is portrayed for the American audience. So in Dieterle's hands, how this topic of jazz gets translated onto the screen. In conversation with none other than the playwright Bertolt Brecht, to whom Dieterle showed an early print of the film, an early cut of the film, he apparently bemoaned to his friend Bertolt Brecht the final cut in which many of the African-American jazz musicians had been excised from the print. This apparently at the urging of the financial backers of the film. This is a very sad story, not only of Hollywood in the 1940s, but I think of America's uneasy relationship to the history of jazz and to the history of African-American cultural expression, more broadly speaking. So two scenes in particular stand out for me in Syncopation. The first is the courtroom drama that ensues after the Chicago rent party is broken up. And what happens in that courtroom drama, very, very different from the courtroom scene, say, in Dieterle's other memorable film, The Life of Émile Zola. In this courtroom drama, what you have essentially is a glorification of jazz, a celebration of the music. The infectious sounds that are created in that scene, everyone joins in unison. They can't help but clapping, but stomping your feet and joining. Another scene from the film that I also find rather striking comes a bit later, and this is when you have the Johnny Schumacher character who sits in this jazz sort of jam session. These are otherwise all African American jazzmen who are playing a number, and Johnny Schumacher at this point, he's a serviceman. This is in the final months of the First World War, and he sits in and basically steals the lessons that he learns. A different way of putting it, perhaps, is this is a case of cultural theft. It's Schumacher learns from these musicians how to play jazz and ultimately will make it his own. Late in the film, you get this dichotomy between the symphonic jazz, those symphonic brownies as they're called here, and the more boogie-woogie style, the jive style of jazz that I think we can link back to that experience of the band leader Johnny Schumacher sitting in with the black jazz musicians in that particular scene. Syncopation was edited by none other than John Sturges. Sturges, who would go on to direct, among other films, The Magnificent Seven. And I should say the film ends on an appropriately upbeat note. The real triumph of jive-style jazz, that boogie-woogie jazz, and a celebration of a native-born tradition. I find this film remarkable in that regard, and it stands up, I think, in relation to other films of the very period that were also attempting to bring jazz to a larger audience. I hope you enjoyed the show.